The deafening crack of a gunshot echoed through the small cabin as Vivian Mitchell pressed herself against the wall, her heart thundering in her chest. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the fresh bullet hole in the wooden floor, mere inches from where she stood. Her husband of 7 years, Thomas Mitchell, swayed drunkenly before her, his bloodshot eyes narrowed with fury as he pointed his Colt revolver at her once more. "I told you never to speak back to me, woman," Thomas slurred, his finger twitching dangerously on the trigger. "Next time I won't miss." The year was 1874, and like many women in the frontier town of Redemption Creek, Wyoming Territory, Vivian had nowhere to run, no one to turn to. At 26 years old, she had spent years enduring Thomas's escalating cruelty, a man who had once courted her with sweet words and promises of a beautiful life together on the frontier. "Thomas, please," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling as she raised her hands in surrender. Her long brown hair hung in disarray around her pale face, and a bruise was already forming on her cheek from where he had struck her earlier. "I only said the stew might need more time to shut your mouth," Thomas roared, advancing toward her with the gun still pointed at her chest. "You think I can't tell when a meal is done? You think I'm stupid?" Vivian closed her eyes, wondering if this would be the night her suffering finally ended. She had married Thomas at 19, the daughter of a struggling shopkeeper who had seen the match as advantageous. Thomas Mitchell had appeared respectable than a man with a small ranch and prospects. No one could have predicted how quickly he would descend into drink and violence once they were wed. "I'm going to the saloon," Thomas finally growled, lowering the gun slightly. "And when I get back, you best have that meal ready proper, or so help me." He let the threat hang in the air, tucking the revolver back into his holster. As soon as the door slammed behind him, Vivian collapsed to the floor, her whole body shaking with sobs. She could still smell the gunpowder in the air, could still feel the splinters that had flown up when the bullets struck the floorboards. Thomas had threatened her before, had hit her countless times, but never had he fired a gun at her. Something had changed tonight, and deep in her heart, Vivian knew that if she stayed, she wouldn't survive much longer. With trembling hands, she began to gather what few possessions she could carry. She had no family left to turn to, no friends close enough to trust with her life. Thomas had made sure of that, isolating her from the townsfolk over the years. But she couldn't stay, not anymore. Vivian packed a small cloth satchel with a spare dress, the locket her mother had given her before she passed, and the meager savings she'd managed to hide away just $3.47. It wasn't much, but perhaps it would be enough to get her to the next town where Thomas wouldn't find her. As night fell across the Wyoming Territory, Vivian Mitchell slipped out the back door of the cabin she had called home for 7 miserable years, and disappeared into the darkness, with nothing but the clothes on her back and a desperate prayer for mercy. The journey through the night was treacherous. Vivian kept to the shadows, avoiding the main road that led to town, terrified that Thomas might return early from the saloon and discover her missing. The spring air was crisp, carrying the scent of sage and pine from the nearby mountains. Under different circumstances, she might have found it beautiful, the vast Wyoming sky scattered with stars that shone like diamonds on black velvet. But beauty was a luxury she couldn't afford to notice, not when every rustle in the brush sent her heart racing with fear. By dawn, Vivian had reached the outskirts of Redemption Creek. The small frontier town was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys as shopkeepers prepared to open for the day. She knew she couldn't linger here. Thomas had too many drinking companions who might spot her and report back to him. Somehow, she needed to find transportation away from this place, as far away as possible. With her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders to hide her bruised face, Vivian made her way toward the stagecoach office. The next coach wouldn't leave until noon, the schedule master informed her, and it would cost $5 for passage to Cheyenne, more than she had. Her heart sank as she turned away, unsure where to go next. That's when she noticed the wagon train preparing on the edge of town. A group of settlers was making ready to head west, toward the promised lands of Oregon Territory. Vivian watched them for a moment, hope flickering in her chest. Perhaps they might need an extra hand, someone to help with cooking or minding children during the long journey. It would take her far from Thomas, far from his reach. With renewed determination, Vivian approached the wagon master, an older man with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Excuse me, sir," she said softly, keeping her head slightly bowed to hide the worst of her bruising. "I was wondering if you might be in need of help on your journey west. I'm a hard worker, good with cooking and sewing, and I don't require much in the way of payment, just passage." The wagon master, who introduced himself as Harold Blackburn, studied her for a long moment, his eyes lingering briefly on the visible edge of her bruise. "We could use another set of hands, especially with 3 families bringing young ones," he said finally. "But I ought to warn you, miss, it's a hard journey, not for the faint of heart." "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Blackburn," Vivian answered, her voice steadier than she'd expected, "and I'm not afraid of hard work." Blackburn nodded slowly. "Very well then, we leave at midday. You'll be helping mainly with the Johnson family. They've got 4 little ones and the mother's expecting another." "What's your name, miss?" "Vivian," she replied, deliberately omitting her surname. "Vivian Moore." The lie came easily, her mother's maiden name falling from her lips as she created her new identity on the spot. "Well, Miss Moore, welcome aboard," Blackburn said, gesturing toward the wagons. "Best get acquainted with the Johnsons before we head out." As Vivian turned toward the indicated wagon, relief flooded through her. She was getting away. Thomas would wake with a hangover, discover her missing, but by then she would be miles away, heading toward a new life. What she didn't notice was the figure watching from the shadows across the street, one of Thomas's regular drinking companions. His eyes narrowed as he recognized the woman speaking to the wagon master. By nightfall, Thomas Mitchell would know exactly where his wife had gone. The wagon train had been traveling for 3 days when Vivian first noticed him. The mysterious rider kept his distance, always appearing on the horizon at dawn, following the caravan throughout the day and disappearing as the sun set. At first, she thought little of it. Lone travelers often shadowed wagon trains for protection against bandits and hostile encounters, but something about the persistent presence unsettled her. "You notice that rider?" asked Catherine Johnson, the pregnant woman Vivian had been assigned to help. Catherine was a kind-hearted woman with a perpetually tired smile, her belly swollen with what would be her 5th child. "Been there since yesterday morning, I reckon." Vivian glanced toward the distant figure, a chill running down her spine despite the warm spring sun. "Yes," she admitted. "I've seen him. Probably just some drifter," Catherine said, bouncing her youngest on her knee as they sat on the wagon seat. "My husband says it's common enough. Safety in numbers out here." Vivian nodded but couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. That evening, as the wagons circled for the night and campfires were lit, she approached Harold Blackburn with her concerns. "Mr. Blackburn," she began hesitantly, "that rider who's been following us, do you know anything about him?" The wagon master tamped tobacco into his pipe thoughtfully before answering. "Can't say I do, Miss Moore, but I've sent word with the scout to invite him to camp if he's of a mind to. Better to know who's on our tail than wonder." That night, Vivian couldn't sleep. She lay awake in the small tent she shared with Catherine's 2 daughters, listening to the sounds of the prairie, the whisper of wind through grass, the distant howl of coyotes, the occasional snort from the oxen tethered nearby. And beneath it all, the constant thrum of fear that Thomas had somehow found her trail. Her fears materialized the following day when the lone rider finally approached the wagon train during the midday rest. Vivian was helping distribute water to the travelers when she heard the commotion. Curious murmurs spread through the camp as the stranger rode in, and Vivian turned to look, her water bucket nearly slipping from suddenly nerveless fingers. The man was not Thomas, but she recognized him immediately. Clyde Wilson, one of her husband's regular drinking companions from the saloon in Redemption Creek. Her blood ran cold as their eyes met across the camp, and she saw the flash of recognition, followed by a slow, cruel smile that spread across his weathered face. Vivian retreated behind the Johnson wagon, her mind racing. Clyde had seen her, which meant it was only a matter of time before Thomas knew where she had gone. He might already be following, his rage building with every mile. "Miss Moore," Catherine called, concern evident in her voice. "Are you unwell? You've gone white as a sheet." I'm fine," Vivian managed, though her voice shook. "Just the heat, I think." But as the day wore on, and Clyde Wilson integrated himself into the wagon train, claiming to be heading to the goldfields further west, Vivian knew her brief taste of freedom was coming to an end. That night, she overheard Clyde speaking with Blackburn, asking questions about the pretty brunette helping the Johnson family. Her time was running out. On the 5th night of the journey, as the wagons made camp near a small creek bordered by cottonwood trees, Vivian made her decision. She couldn't remain with the wagon train, not with Clyde watching her every move, undoubtedly waiting for Thomas to catch up. She would have to slip away under cover of darkness, strike out on her own. It was madness, she knew. A woman alone in the wilderness faced dangers beyond imagining, from nature, from animals, from men. But staying seemed the greater risk now. After the camp had settled for the night, Vivian gathered what few possessions she had, along with some food she had quietly set aside throughout the day. With a whispered apology to the sleeping Johnson children, she slipped out of the tent and into the moonlit night, keeping to the shadows as she made her way toward the creek. Her plan was simple but desperate: follow the water until she reached the next settlement, whatever that might be. She had made it perhaps half a mile downstream when she heard the snap of a twig behind her. Vivian froze, her heart hammering in her chest. "Leaving so soon, Mrs. Mitchell?" Clyde's voice was like ice water down her spine. "Your husband's been mighty worried about you." Vivian turned slowly to face him, her fingers tightening around the small knife she'd taken from the Johnsons' cooking supplies. "How did you find me?" Clyde chuckled, moving closer. In the moonlight, she could see the gleam of his eyes, the smirk that twisted his mouth. "Town like Redemption Creek, somebody's always watching. Thomas is offering a handsome reward for information about his runaway wife." "I'm not going back," Vivian said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Tell him whatever you want, but I'm never going back to him." "Now that's not for you to decide, is it?" Clyde took another step toward her. "Thomas will be meeting up with us tomorrow, sent me ahead to make sure you didn't get any ideas about running off." His eyes drifted to the small bag in her hand. "Seems I was right to keep watch." Vivian backed away, her foot slipping on the muddy bank of the creek. "Please," she whispered, hating the desperation in her voice. "You don't understand what he's like. He'll kill me if I go back." "That's between husband and wife," Clyde replied coldly. "Now we're going back to camp and you're going to behave yourself until Thomas arrives, or things will go very badly for you, Mrs. Mitchell." He reached for her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. Vivian reacted instinctively, slashing out with the small knife. Clyde cursed as the blade cut across his forearm, more in surprise than serious injury. His shock quickly turned to rage, and he struck her hard across the face, sending her sprawling to the ground, the knife flying from her grasp. "You'll pay for that," he growled, standing over her with one hand pressed to his bleeding arm. "Thomas said to bring you back alive, but he didn't say nothing about what condition you needed to be in." As Clyde reached down to grab her, the crack of a rifle shot split the night. Dirt sprayed up inches from Clyde's boot, and he jerked back, head whipping around to locate the source of the threat. "Step away from the lady." The voice was deep, steady, and carried the unmistakable promise of lethal force if disobeyed. Emerging from the shadows of the cottonwoods was a tall figure astride a magnificent chestnut horse. The moonlight revealed a man in his early 30s, broad-shouldered and lean, with a weathered face shadowed by the brim of his hat. The rifle in his hands was aimed squarely at Clyde's chest, and there wasn't the slightest tremor in his grip. "This ain't your concern, mister," Clyde said, though he took another step back from Vivian. "This is between me and her." "Doesn't look that way to me," the stranger replied, his voice calm but hard as steel. "Way I see it, you're threatening a lady who clearly wants nothing to do with you." He glanced briefly at Vivian, who was still on the ground, her cheek stinging from Clyde's blow. "You all right, madam?" Vivian nodded mutely, too stunned by this unexpected intervention to speak. "This woman's a runaway wife," Clyde said, his hand hovering near his own pistol. "I'm bringing her back to her husband, as is proper." The stranger's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Don't much care who she's running from. No man puts his hands on a woman like that." He nudged his horse forward a few steps. "Now, I'm going to ask you once more to walk away." Clyde's face contorted with rage and foolish courage. His hand darted to his holster, but he never completed the draw. The stranger's rifle cracked again, and Clyde cried out as the bullet tore through his shoulder, sending his pistol tumbling to the ground. "Next one goes through your heart," the stranger said quietly. "Make your choice." Clutching his bleeding shoulder, Clyde stumbled backward. "This ain't over," he spat, his face pale with pain and fury. "Thomas Mitchell will be here by tomorrow, and he's got a posse with him." "You've made a grave mistake, mister." "Wouldn't be my first," the stranger replied evenly. "Now get." As Clyde disappeared into the darkness, cursing and stumbling, the stranger dismounted and approached Vivian, his rifle now lowered but still ready. Up close, she could see his features more clearly, strong jaw darkened with several days' stubble, eyes the color of a summer storm, and a small scar that cut through his right eyebrow. He removed his hat as he knelt beside her, revealing dark hair shot through with strands of copper where the moonlight touched it. "Are you hurt, madam?" he asked, his voice gentler now. Just shaken," Vivian managed, her hand going to her throbbing cheek. "Thank you for intervening, mister." "Fletcher, Kieran Fletcher." He offered her a hand up, which she took gratefully. His palm was calloused but warm against her trembling fingers. "And you are—" "Vivian," she replied, hesitating only a moment before adding, "Vivian Mitchell, though I wish I weren't." Understanding dawned in Kieran Fletcher's eyes. "The husband that man mentioned, he's the one you're running from." Vivian nodded, shame and fear twisting in her gut. He's not a good man, Mr. Fletcher. Few men who send others to hunt down their wives are," Kieran replied grimly. He glanced in the direction Clyde had fled. "That one will be back at your wagon train by now, raising the alarm, and if what he said is true about your husband arriving tomorrow with others." "I have to get away," Vivian said desperately. "I can't go back to him. Last time I saw him, he fired his gun at me. Next time, he won't miss." Kieran's expression hardened at her words. He was silent for a moment, seeming to weigh something in his mind. "I've got a cabin," he said finally. "About 15 miles northwest of here, in a valley that doesn't see much traffic. You'd be safe there until you figure out your next move." Vivian stared at him, stunned by the offer. "Why would you help me? You don't even know me." A shadow passed over Kieran's face, something old and painful that he quickly masked. "Let's just say I've seen what men like your husband can do." He extended his hand again. "It's your choice, Mrs. Mitchell, but we need to move quickly if you want to be far from here by dawn." Vivian looked into his eyes, searching for any sign of deception or ill intent. She found none, only a steady resolve and what seemed like genuine concern. In that moment, she made her decision, placing her hand in his once more. "Please," she said softly, "call me Vivian." As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, Vivian and Kieran crested a ridge overlooking a small, hidden valley. The journey through the night had been largely silent, with Vivian seated behind Kieran on his horse, her arms wrapped tentatively around his waist. Despite her exhaustion, she had remained alert, her senses heightened by both fear and the strange intimacy of their flight together. "There it is," Kieran said, nodding toward a small cabin nestled among pine trees beside a clear, rushing stream. "Not much to look at, but it's solid enough." Vivian studied the cabin with growing relief. It was indeed modest, a simple one-room structure with a stone chimney and a small corral for horses, but to her eyes, it looked like sanctuary. Smoke rose from the chimney, which Kieran explained was from the banked fire he'd left when he'd set out hunting 3 days prior. "You live here alone?" she asked as they descended toward the valley floor. Kieran nodded. "For the past 2 years. Worked as a ranch hand, then guide for the army, saved up enough to stake my own claim. It's quiet out here, suits me." As they approached, Vivian noticed the careful construction of the cabin, the neat dovetail joints at the corners. the even placement of the shingles, the small garden plot that had been recently turned for spring planting. This was no temporary shelter, but a home that someone had built with care and intention. Kieran helped her down from the horse, his hands strong and steady at her waist. The brief contact sent an unexpected flutter through her chest, which she quickly attributed to nerves and exhaustion. "You must be dead on your feet," he said, leading the horse to the corral. "Go on inside. There's coffee on the shelf next to the stove if you want to get some going." The interior of the cabin was as meticulously kept as the exterior, surprisingly so for a man living alone in the wilderness. A neatly made bed occupied one corner, a solid table and 2 chairs another. A stone fireplace dominated the far wall, with a cooking area beside it. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and supplies. Vivian set about rekindling the fire and brewing coffee, finding comfort in the familiar domestic task after the terror and uncertainty of the past days. By the time Kieran entered, having tended to his horse, she had a pot bubbling and had discovered some cornmeal that could be made into porridge. "Hope you don't mind," she said, gesturing to the preparations. "I thought you might be hungry after riding all night." Something like surprise flickered across Kieran's face before he smiled, the first real smile she'd seen from him, transforming his stern features into something quite handsome. "Not at all. It's been a while since anyone cooked in this cabin but me." They ate in companionable silence, the events of the night finally catching up to Vivian as exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. Kieran seemed to notice, for he soon stood and gestured toward the bed. "You should rest," he said. "I'll keep watch in case that fellow from last night somehow tracked us." "But where will you sleep?" Vivian asked, suddenly aware that the cabin contained only the one bed. "I've spent plenty of nights in that chair," Kieran replied, nodding to a sturdy rocking chair near the fireplace. "Been a long while since I've had the luxury of worrying about where someone else might sleep." Vivian hesitated, the bed looking more inviting by the second. "I can't take your bed, Mr. Fletcher, not after everything you've done already." "Kieran," he corrected her gently, "and yes, you can. You're exhausted and you're safe here. That's what matters right now." Too tired to argue further, Vivian yielded, removing only her boots before lying down on the surprisingly comfortable bed. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Kieran settling into the rocking chair, rifle across his knees, his vigilant gaze fixed on the door. When she woke, golden afternoon light was streaming through the cabin's single window. For a disorienting moment, Vivian couldn't remember where she was, panic rising in her throat as she sat up quickly. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back and she looked around the cabin for her unlikely rescuer. Kieran was gone, but a note had been left on the table, held down by a cup of water. "Gone hunting. Back by sunset. Bar the door, rifle loaded above fireplace if needed." The simple message both reassured and unsettled her. Reassured because it meant Kieran had indeed left her safely sheltered rather than abandoning her or worse. Unsettled because it implied there might be danger that necessitated a barred door and loaded rifle. Vivian rose, washed her face in the basin of fresh water Kieran had left, and set about examining her temporary haven more thoroughly. The books on the shelves surprised her: volumes of poetry by Whitman and Tennyson, histories of the frontier, even a well-worn copy of David Copperfield. These weren't the possessions she would have expected from a solitary frontiersman. A small box on one shelf caught her attention. Hesitating, only briefly aware she was prying, but unable to resist her curiosity about the man who had saved her, Vivian opened it. Inside was a tarnished silver pocket watch, a woman's wedding band, and a yellow daguerreotype of a young woman with a serious expression but kind eyes. She quickly closed the box, feeling she had intruded on something deeply personal. The remainder of the afternoon passed slowly as Vivian found ways to occupy herself. She swept the floor, reorganized the pantry supplies, and even began preparing a stew with some of the dried meat and vegetables she found. It felt good to be useful, to repay Kieran's kindness in some small way. As the light began to fade, however, anxiety crept back. What if Kieran didn't return? What if Thomas had somehow found them? What if the man who had seemed so trustworthy had motives she hadn't discerned? The sound of approaching hoofbeats sent her heart racing. Vivian grabbed the rifle from above the fireplace, checking that it was indeed loaded as she positioned herself behind the door, prepared to defend herself if necessary. "Vivian," Kieran's voice called from outside. "It's me." Relief washed over her as she lowered the rifle and unbarred the door. Kieran stood on the threshold, a brace of rabbits in one hand, his expression shifting from wariness to approval as he noted the rifle in her grasp. "Good," he said, stepping inside. "You're cautious, you'll need to be." "Did something happen?" Vivian asked, setting the rifle aside. "While you were out, I mean." Kieran shook his head, moving to the table to begin dressing the rabbits. No sign of anyone following, but that doesn't mean they're not looking. He paused, glancing up at her. "Your husband Thomas, was it? He sounds like the type who won't give up easily." "No," Vivian agreed quietly, returning to the stove where her stew simmered. "He's not. He sees me as his property, something he owns, and Thomas Mitchell doesn't let go of what he believes is his." Kieran's hands stilled for a moment, his expression darkening. "No man owns another person," he said, his voice low with suppressed anger. "Not a wife, not anyone." Something in his tone made Vivian study him more carefully. "You speak like someone who's seen the worst of men." A muscle tightened in Kieran's jaw. "I've seen enough," he replied simply, returning to his task. They ate dinner together as darkness fell completely, the stew complemented by the fresh rabbit Kieran had prepared. As they shared the meal, Vivian found herself relaxing in his presence, the terror of the previous days receding slightly in the warmth and safety of the cabin. "How long were you married?" Kieran asked finally, breaking a comfortable silence. 7 years, Vivian replied, her hand unconsciously going to the faded bruise on her cheek. "Though it feels like a lifetime. Was he always?" Kieran let the question trail off, but his meaning was clear. Vivian shook her head, staring into her bowl. "No. Or at least he hid it well at first. Thomas was charming when he courted me, brought gifts for my father, spoke of the fine life we'd have on his ranch." She gave a bitter laugh. "I was 19 and foolish, dazzled by his attention and promises. It wasn't until after the wedding that I saw who he truly was." "What changed him?" Kieran asked, his gray eyes intent upon her face. "Nothing changed him. He simply stopped pretending," Vivian said softly. "The drinking got worse, the ranch began to fail, and he needed someone to blame. I was." "Convenient." Kieran was silent for a long moment. "And no one helped you? Family, friends?" "My parents died in a fever outbreak the year after I married, and Thomas made sure I had few friends, said a wife's place was in the home, not gossiping in town." Vivian's voice grew quieter still. "The few times I tried to speak up, people in town looked the other way. A man's business is his own, they'd say. What happens between husband and wife stays between husband and wife." "That's a convenient excuse for cowards," Kieran said, anger evident in his tone. "For people who don't want to get involved." "Is that why you helped me?" Vivian asked, looking up to meet his gaze. "Because you're not a coward," something unreadable passed across Kieran's face. "I helped you because what that man was doing was wrong, and because," he hesitated, "because I've seen what happens when good people look the other way." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but it was a different sort of quiet now, one filled with unspoken understanding and a tentative connection that Vivian couldn't quite name. As they cleared away the dinner things, Kieran spoke again. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need to. It's safe and your husband's unlikely to find this place, but eventually you'll need to decide where you want to go from here." "I hadn't thought beyond getting away," Vivian admitted. "I have a cousin in California, my mother's sister's daughter. We wrote to each other when I was younger. Perhaps she would take me in, at least until I can find work." Kieran nodded thoughtfully. "California is a good distance, far enough that a man like Thomas Mitchell might give up the chase." He hesitated before adding, "I could help you get there when you're ready. I know the trails, the safest routes." Vivian stared at him in surprise. "Why would you do that? You've already risked enough for a stranger." "Maybe I don't consider you a stranger anymore," Kieran replied simply. That night, despite Vivian's protests, Kieran again took the rocking chair, insisting she keep the bed. As she drifted towards sleep, watching the firelight play across his features as he kept his silent vigil, Vivian realized it was the first time in years she had felt truly safe in the presence of a man. The next 3 days fell into an unexpected pattern of domestic tranquility. Vivian took over much of the cooking and indoor work, while Kieran tended to his small herd of cattle, repaired fences, and kept a watchful eye on the approaches to the hidden valley. Each evening, they shared meals and conversation that grew increasingly easy and open. Vivian learned that Kieran had come west after the war, where he had served in the Union Army. He spoke little of that time, but she gathered it had left deep scars, both visible and invisible. He had worked as a cowboy, a scout, even briefly as a deputy marshal in a small Kansas town before seeking the solitude of his mountain cabin. In turn, she told him about her childhood in Ohio, her family's journey west when she was 14, and the dreams she had once harbored of becoming a teacher before her hasty marriage to Thomas had altered her course. "You still could, you know," Kieran said one evening as they sat on the cabin's small porch, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and crimson. "Become a teacher, I mean. Towns out west are always in need of educated women willing to take on schoolchildren." Vivian smiled wistfully. "Perhaps, though I'd need to find a town far enough from Redemption Creek that Thomas would never find me. California's full of towns like that," Kieran observed, his voice casual though his eyes were watchful. "And growing more every year from what I hear." On the fourth morning, Vivian woke to find Kieran already gone, a note explaining he had ridden to a trading post 20 miles away to gather supplies and information. "Lock the door," his message concluded. "I'll be back by nightfall." The day passed with agonizing slowness, Vivian jumping at every sound outside the cabin. By late afternoon, dark clouds had gathered over the mountains and thunder rumbled in the distance. As rain began to patter against the roof, her worry deepened. The trails in these mountains could become treacherous in storms. It was well after dark, rain now falling in sheets, when Vivian finally heard the approach of a horse. She grabbed the rifle, positioning herself as before, and called out, "Who's there?" "It's me," came Kieran's voice, though it sounded strained. "I'm alone." Vivian unbarred the door to find Kieran slumped in the saddle, soaked to the skin and clutching his side. As he dismounted, she saw with horror that his shirt was stained with blood. "What happened?" she cried, rushing to support him as he staggered toward the door. "Ran into some trouble," Kieran grunted, leaning heavily against her. "Nothing to worry about." Inside, under the lamplight, Vivian could see the truth was far more serious. A deep gash ran along Kieran's side, still seeping blood, and his face was pale with pain and what she suspected was blood loss. "This is more than trouble," she said firmly, helping him to a chair. "You've been stabbed or shot or knife," Kieran admitted, wincing as she helped him remove his sodden coat. "Couple of rough characters at the trading post, asking questions about a woman fitting your description." Vivian's blood ran cold. "Thomas sent them." Kieran nodded grimly. "Your husband's offering a substantial reward for information about you. When I overheard them questioning the trading post owner, I tried to leave quietly. They followed me outside." He gave a pained smile. "They won't be following anyone for a while, but one of them got lucky with his blade." Working quickly, Vivian heated water and gathered the medical supplies Kieran directed her to. She had tended injuries before life on the frontier had taught her basic medical skills, but never something this severe, and never on someone who had risked his life for her. "This is my fault," she whispered as she cleaned the wound, her hands trembling slightly. "You're hurt because of me." "No," Kieran said sharply, catching her wrist. His gray eyes blazed with intensity despite his pain. "This is because of men who think they can own people, who think their money and violence gives them the right to control others. It's not your fault, Vivian. None of this is." Something in the way he said her name, the fierce conviction in his voice, made her chest tighten with emotions she didn't dare examine too closely. Instead, she focused on the task at hand, cleaning and bandaging the wound as best she could. "You're good at this," Kieran observed, watching her work. "Steady hands." Necessity, Vivian replied softly. Thomas wasn't one to pay for a doctor when I could stitch him up after a brawl. Kieran's expression darkened at the mention of Thomas, but he remained silent as she finished dressing the wound. When she was done, he caught her hand again, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. "Thank you," he said simply. That night, despite his protests, Vivian insisted Kieran take the bed to recover his strength. She took the rocking chair, rifle across her lap as she maintained the vigil he had kept for her. As rain continued to drum against the roof, she watched him sleep. His features relaxed in a way she hadn't seen before. It struck her then, with a clarity that was both frightening and exhilarating, that in just a few short days, this man had shown her more kindness, more respect than Thomas had in 7 years of marriage. More dangerously, she realized that the flutter in her chest whenever Kieran looked at her, spoke to her, or accidentally touched her hand in passing was something she hadn't felt in a very long time: attraction. The thought should have terrified her. After Thomas, after everything she had endured, the idea of having feelings for another man seemed impossible. And yet, as lightning illuminated Kieran's sleeping face for a brief moment, Vivian acknowledged the truth to herself. She was drawn to this quiet, honorable man who had risked everything for a stranger, but such feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford, she reminded herself sternly. Her priority had to be escape from Thomas, from the past, from the fear that had defined her life for too long. Once she reached California, once she was truly free, perhaps then she could consider what her heart was trying to tell her. For now, she would focus on helping Kieran heal, on repaying the debt she owed him. And then, reluctantly, she would have to leave him behind. The storm continued through the night and into the next day, keeping them confined to the cabin. Kieran's wound, though serious, showed no signs of infection, much to Vivian's relief. He was weak from blood loss, but insisted on getting up briefly to tend to necessary tasks, stubbornly refusing to be confined to bed despite her protests. "I've had worse," he told her with a wry smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "During the war, took a rebel bullet through the shoulder at Shiloh. This is a scratch by comparison." "A scratch that nearly bled you dry," Vivian countered, but she couldn't help smiling at his determination. By evening, the rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, and a comfortable quiet settled over the cabin. Vivian prepared a simple supper of beans and cornbread, which they ate by lamplight as the fire crackled in the hearth. Outside, the world was washed clean by the storm, the air filled with the scent of wet pine and earth. "Kieran," Vivian said finally, breaking the silence, "those men at the trading post, do you think they followed you?" He considered the question, his expression serious. "I don't believe so. I took precautions, doubled back a few times, and the storm would have washed away any tracks." He hesitated before adding, "But that doesn't mean others won't come looking. Your husband sounds like a determined man." "He is," Vivian agreed softly, "especially when his pride is wounded. And my leaving would have hurt his pride more than anything." "Then we should make plans to get you to California sooner rather than later," Kieran said, setting aside his empty bowl. "Once I'm healed enough to travel, we can—" "No," Vivian interrupted, surprising herself with her vehemence. "I can't ask that of you. You've already been injured because of me. I won't put you at further risk." Kieran's expression softened. "You're not asking, Vivian, I'm offering, and I'd hardly be sending you off alone knowing there are men hunting for you." "But why?" The question that had been burning in her mind for days finally escaped. "Why risk so much for someone you barely know?" Kieran was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, tinged with an old sorrow. "I had a sister once, Elizabeth. She married young like you to a man everyone thought was respectable." He paused, his hand unconsciously going to the small scar through his eyebrow. "By the time I came home from the war, things had deteriorated. I could see the bruises she tried to hide, the fear in her eyes whenever he was near." Vivian sat perfectly still, barely breathing as Kieran continued. "I confronted him, told her she could come stay with me until she sorted things out. He seemed to accept it at the time." Kieran's voice grew even quieter. That night, he beat her so badly she never woke up. By the time I got there the next day, he was gone and she was. He couldn't finish the sentence. Oh, Kieran, Vivian whispered, her heart breaking for him, for the sister he couldn't save. I tracked him for months, Kieran said, his expression hardening. Finally found him in a saloon in St. Louis. He didn't recognize me at first. It had been years since we'd met and the war had changed me. We played cards. I let him win a few hands, bought him drinks, then I told him who I was. A cold smile that held no humor touched his lips. He drew on me. I was faster. The implications of his words hung in the air between them. Vivian should have been frightened by this revelation, by the knowledge that the man sitting across from her had killed another in cold blood. Instead, she felt a strange sense of understanding, even justice. After that, I couldn't stay in one place, Kieran continued. Drifted west, took whatever work I could find, eventually ended up here. He finally looked up, meeting her eyes directly. So when I say I understand what you're running from, Vivian, I mean it, and I won't let what happened to Elizabeth happen to you. Without thinking, Vivian reached across the table and took his hand in hers. I'm so sorry about your sister, she said softly. And I'm grateful more than I can express for what you've done for me. Kieran's fingers tightened around hers, warm and strong. For a long moment they sat in silence, connected by touch and by the understanding that comes from shared pain. We'll leave in 3 days, Kieran said finally, though he didn't release her hand. Head west through the mountains, then south toward California. It's not the easiest route, but it's the one where we're least likely to encounter others. Vivian nodded, already dreading the day she would have to say goodbye to this man who had come to mean so much to her in such a short time. But that was a pain for another day. For now, she was safe, and they had a plan. That night, as they again took their respective sleeping places, Kieran reluctantly returning to the bed at Vivian's insistence, due to his injury, she found herself watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, wondering how fate had led her to this cabin, to this man. For the first time in years, despite the danger that still pursued her, Vivian felt a flicker of hope for the future, a future where she might know peace, and perhaps, someday, even love again. The 3 days passed quickly as they prepared for the journey. Kieran's wound began to heal, and though he still moved with care, his strength was returning. Vivian took inventory of the supplies they would need, mended clothing, and preserved what food could be carried. Together, they pored over Kieran's maps, planning their route to California, identifying safe places to rest and towns to avoid. On what was to be their last evening in the cabin, Vivian stood at the small window, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold. She had grown fond of this hidden place, this sanctuary that had given her the first taste of peace she had known in years. Leaving it felt like abandoning a friend. It's beautiful, isn't it? Kieran said quietly, coming to stand beside her. That's why I chose this valley. No matter how hard the day has been, that view makes it worthwhile. Vivian nodded, acutely aware of his presence next to her, of the warmth that seemed to radiate from him. I'll miss it, she admitted. I've felt safe here. You'll be safe again, Kieran promised, his voice low and reassuring. California's a new start. You can build the life you want there. The unspoken question hung in the air between them. Would he be part of that life? Vivian didn't dare ask, and Kieran offered no answers. Instead, they stood in companionable silence, watching as the sun slipped behind the mountains and the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. That night, sleep eluded Vivian. She lay awake in the bed, listening to the soft sounds of the cabin, the occasional creak of the rocking chair where Kieran kept watch, the pop and hiss of the dying fire, the distant call of an owl outside. Tomorrow they would leave this place, begin the long journey to California, and then… what? Would Kieran simply deliver her safely to her destination and return to his solitary life here? The thought left an ache in her chest that she couldn't ignore. Just before dawn, as the first gray light seeped through the window, Vivian was startled from her restless thoughts by Kieran suddenly rising from his chair, rifle in hand. "What is it?" she whispered, sitting up quickly. "Horses," he replied tersely, moving to the window. "At least 3, maybe 4, coming up the valley. Vivian's heart began to race. Thomas, possibly. Kieran's expression was grim as he checked his rifle. Get dressed quickly. There's a trapdoor under the rug by the hearth root cellar beneath. If things go badly, that's your way out. Tunnel leads to a cave about 100 yards up the hillside. I'm not hiding while you face them alone, Vivian protested, hurriedly pulling on her boots. Kieran turned to her, his gray eyes intense in the dim light. Vivian, please. I can't focus on protecting you if I'm worried about you being caught in crossfire. Before she could argue further, the sound of approaching riders grew louder. Kieran positioned himself by the window, partially concealed by the curtain, his rifle ready. 4 riders, he confirmed quietly. Armed, one of them matches the description you gave of Thomas. Fear clutched at Vivian's throat, but she forced it down. She would not be a helpless victim, not anymore. Moving quietly, she retrieved the pistol Kieran had shown her the day before, checking that it was loaded as he had taught her. Kieran glanced back at her, a mixture of concern and reluctant approval in his eyes. Stay back from the windows, he instructed. Let me do the talking. The riders halted about 30 yards from the cabin. In the growing light, Vivian could make out their figures through the window, 4 men on horseback, one of them unmistakably Thomas. His broad shoulders and the distinctive tilt of his hat immediately recognizable even at a distance. Beside him was Clyde Wilson, his arm in a crude sling, his face twisted with malice even from afar. Fletcher, Thomas's voice boomed across the clearing. We know you're in there, and we know you've got my wife. Kieran remained silent, his finger resting lightly on the trigger of his rifle. Come out and face me like a man, Thomas continued, his voice growing angrier. Or are you the kind who hides behind a woman's skirts? That's rich, coming from a man who beats his wife, Kieran called back, his voice steady and carrying. 4 armed men against 1 cabin doesn't seem like much of a fair fight, Mitchell. Thomas's laugh was ugly, carrying even through the closed door. Fair, you stole my property, Fletcher. A man's wife belongs to him by law. You're nothing but a thief and a kidnapper. A woman isn't property, Kieran replied coldly, and Vivian came with me willingly to escape a man who threatened her life. Lies, Thomas roared. She's filled your head with lies just like she's probably filled your bed. My wife's nothing but a deceitful whore, and you're a fool if you believe anything she says. Vivian flinched at the words, the old shame and fear threatening to overwhelm her. But then she felt Kieran's hand briefly touch her arm, a gesture of reassurance and support that anchored her to the present. Here's what's going to happen, Mitchell, Kieran called out, his voice hard as steel. You and your friends are going to get back on your horses and ride away. Vivian stays here under my protection. If you try to force your way in, not all of you will leave this valley alive. That's a promise. For a long moment, silence stretched across the clearing. Then Thomas's voice came again, lower but no less menacing. You've got it wrong, Fletcher. Either my wife comes out now, or we burn that cabin to the ground with both of you in it. Your choice. As if to emphasize his point, one of the men with Thomas raised a flaming torch, the fire bright against the dawn sky. Kieran, Vivian whispered, fear gripping her heart. They'll do it. Thomas won't back down, not when his pride is at stake. Kieran's expression remained calm, but she could see the rapid calculation in his eyes. We need to get to the horses, he said quietly. If we can reach the trail behind the cabin, we have a chance of outrunning them through the woods. And if we can't, Kieran met her gaze directly. Then I'll make sure you get away, whatever it takes. The weight of his words, the implication of sacrifice, sent a surge of emotion through Vivian so powerful it nearly took her breath away. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that she had fallen in love with Kieran Fletcher, this quiet, honorable man who had risked everything to protect her. I'm not leaving without you, she said firmly. Before Kieran could respond, a flaming arrow arced through the air, striking the roof of the cabin with a soft thud. A second followed, then a third, as Thomas's men began their assault. We need to move. Now. Kieran grabbed his saddlebags, tossing them to Vivian along with a canteen. Through the back door, stay low and run for the trees. Smoke was already beginning to curl down from the roof as Vivian followed Kieran to the rear of the cabin. He eased the door open a crack, surveying the area behind the house. one man watching the back, he whispered. When I give the signal, run straight for the pines. Don't stop, don't look back. Vivian nodded, her heart pounding in her ears. Kieran took a deep breath, then flung the door open and fired twice in rapid succession. A cry of pain told her his shots had found their mark. Now. Kieran urged, pushing her forward. Vivian ran, clutching the saddlebags to her chest, her feet finding purchase on the damp earth as she sprinted toward the line of pine trees. Behind her, she heard more gunshots, the angry shouts of men, and the crackling of flames as the cabin's roof began to burn in earnest. Reaching the shelter of the trees, Vivian turned, desperate to see if Kieran was following. To her horror, she saw him engaged in a firefight with Thomas and his remaining men, using the corner of the now burning cabin as cover. Even as she watched, Kieran took careful aim and fired, sending one of Thomas's companions tumbling from his saddle. "Kieran," she cried, moving to go back. "Stay there," he shouted, diving to avoid a shot from Clyde. "Get to the horses." Torn between obedience and fear for his safety, Vivian hesitated. In that moment of indecision, she saw Thomas circle around the side of the cabin, pistol raised, aiming directly at Kieran's exposed back. Without thinking, Vivian raised her own pistol and fired. The shot went wide, but it was enough to alert Kieran to the danger. He spun, firing in one fluid motion. Thomas staggered, clutching his shoulder, but didn't fall. Taking advantage of the distraction, Kieran sprinted toward the trees where Vivian waited. Together, they ran deeper into the forest, toward the small corral where Kieran kept his horses. Behind them, angry shouts and sporadic gunfire indicated their pursuers were not giving up. "You're bleeding," Vivian gasped as they reached the corral, noticing for the first time the dark stain spreading on Kieran's shirt sleeve. "Just a graze," he replied tersely, quickly saddling 2 horses. "They're coming. We need to ride." Mounting quickly, they urged their horses up the steep trail that led away from the valley. As they crested the ridge, Vivian looked back one last time at the cabin that had been her sanctuary. Flames now engulfed the roof completely, black smoke billowing against the morning sky. In the clearing before it, Thomas stood with his remaining men, his face contorted with rage as he watched them escape. "He won't stop," Vivian said, her voice hollow with dread. "He'll keep coming after us." Kieran's expression was grim but determined as he led them deeper into the forest. "Then we'll just have to be smarter, faster, and more determined than he is." As they rode through the dense pine forest, the sound of pursuit gradually faded behind them. Kieran led them on a winding path that crossed streams and rocky outcroppings, clearly intending to make their trail as difficult to follow as possible. Despite the urgency of their flight, Vivian couldn't help but marvel at the beauty of the wilderness around them: towering pines, meadows dotted with spring wildflowers, and the distant snow-capped peaks of the mountains. By midday, they had covered considerable ground, though Vivian noticed with concern that Kieran was growing pale, his wounded arm held stiffly against his side. When they paused to rest the horses beside a small stream, she insisted on examining his injury. "It's worse than you let on," she said accusingly, as she unwrapped the hasty bandage he had applied during their brief stops. The bullet had indeed only grazed him, but the wound was deep enough to have bled steadily throughout the morning, and the skin around it was hot to the touch. "We couldn't afford to stop longer," Kieran replied, wincing as she cleaned the wound with water from the stream. "Thomas and his men won't be far behind." "You'll be no good to either of us if you collapse from blood loss or fever," Vivian countered, tearing a strip from her petticoat to make a fresh bandage. The casual intimacy of tending to him, of touching his bare skin, sent an unexpected warmth through her despite their precarious situation. Kieran watched her work, his gray eyes softer than she had seen them before. "You're good at that," he said quietly, "taking care of people." "I've had practice," Vivian replied with a wry smile, though usually with less willing patience. A shadow passed over Kieran's face at the implicit reference to Thomas. "I'm sorry," he said after a moment, "for what you endured. No one deserves that kind of treatment, especially not someone as kind and brave as you." Vivian's hands stilled on the bandage, surprised by the unexpected praise. Brave, I ran away, Kieran, I hid. There's nothing brave about that. Leaving an abusive husband, starting over with nothing but the clothes on your back, trusting a stranger in the wilderness. Kieran shook his head. That takes more courage than most men I've known in battle. His words warmed something deep within her, a part of her spirit that Thomas had nearly extinguished with years of cruelty and degradation. Before she could respond, however, a distant sound caught their attention, the faint but unmistakable echo of horses' hooves. They found our trail, Kieran said, immediately alert. We need to move. They rode hard through the afternoon, following game trails and creek beds, occasionally doubling back to confuse their pursuers. As the sun began to sink toward the western horizon, Kieran led them into a narrow canyon, its walls rising steeply on either side. There's a place up ahead where we can shelter for the night, he explained, his voice tense with pain and exhaustion. Old Trapper's cabin I found last winter. Not much more than 3 walls and a roof, but it'll keep us hidden. The cabin, when they reached it, was indeed little more than a crude shelter built against the base of the canyon wall, half concealed by a stand of aspens. But it offered protection from the elements and, more importantly, from searching eyes. Inside, Kieran collapsed onto a rough wooden bench, his face alarmingly pale in the fading light. Vivian immediately set about making him comfortable, using their limited supplies to create a pallet on the dirt floor, then helping him to lie down. You need rest, she insisted when he tried to rise again. I'll keep watch. Too exhausted to argue, Kieran relented, though his hand lingered on hers for a moment longer than necessary. Wake me in a few hours, he murmured, his eyes already closing. We'll need to move before dawn. Vivian nodded, though she had no intention of disturbing his much-needed rest unless danger presented itself. Taking the rifle, she positioned herself by the cabin's single window, which offered a view of the approach through the canyon. As night fell and the first stars appeared overhead, Vivian kept her vigil, her mind racing with thoughts of the day's events and the uncertain future that lay ahead. The cabin that had been her haven was now ash. The plans they had carefully made were scattered to the wind, and Thomas, still alive, still hunting them, remained a deadly threat. Yet despite these dangers, despite the fear that still lurked at the edges of her consciousness, Vivian realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Hope, and something more complex and frightening, that she was only beginning to acknowledge feelings for the wounded man sleeping fitfully behind her. It was foolish, she knew. She was still legally married, still bound to Thomas in the eyes of the law if not in her heart. And Kieran, honorable, principled Kieran, would never pursue a relationship with a married woman, especially one he had rescued from danger. His kindness, his protection, stemmed from his tragic past, from his determination to prevent another woman from suffering his sister's fate. But in the quiet darkness of the trapper's cabin, with only the soft sound of Kieran's breathing and the distant call of a night bird for company, Vivian allowed herself to imagine a different future. One where she was free, truly free, to choose her own path. One where, perhaps, that path might lead back to a certain cabin in a hidden valley, to a man with storm-gray eyes and a heart as vast as the Wyoming sky. Dawn found them moving again, though Kieran's condition worried Vivian deeply. His wound showed signs of infection despite her best efforts, and he moved with the careful precision of someone in constant pain. Still, his determination never wavered as he led them deeper into the mountains, following trails that seemed invisible to her eyes. There's a settlement about 20 miles west of here, he explained as they paused to rest the horses near a high alpine meadow. Silver mining town called Prosperity. Not much more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of cabins, but there's a doctor, their old army surgeon, who patched me up once before. Will we be safe there? Vivian asked, scanning the horizon anxiously. Though they had seen no sign of pursuit since leaving the trapper's cabin, she couldn't shake the feeling that Thomas was still out there, hunting them. Safer than on the trail, Kieran replied grimly. The town's small enough that strangers stand out. If Thomas and his men show up, we'll have warning. He didn't add what they both knew, that, in his weakened condition, he was in no state to protect her if their pursuers caught up with them. They reached prosperity as the sun was setting, the small collection of buildings nestled in a valley surrounded by pine-covered slopes. Despite its grandiose name, the town was indeed little more than a cluster of wooden structures along a rutted dirt street, with the skeletal frameworks of mine entrances visible on the hillsides above. The doctor, a gruff older man named Elias Green, answered their knock with a scowl that quickly turned to concern when he saw Kieran's condition. "Fletcher," he greeted, helping Vivian support Kieran's weight as they entered the small cabin that served as both home and medical office. "What trouble have you gotten yourself into this time?" "The kind that follows, Doc," Kieran replied weakly. "This is Vivian. She's under my protection." Green's shrewd eyes took in Vivian's disheveled appearance and the fading bruise on her face, understanding dawning in his weathered features. "I see," he said simply. "Well, let's get you patched up before your trouble comes knocking." As the doctor worked on Kieran's wound, cleaning, stitching, and applying a poultice of herbs that filled the cabin with a pungent aroma, Vivian explained their situation in hushed tones. She was surprised by her own candor, admitting to this stranger her marriage to Thomas, the years of abuse, and Kieran's intervention that had saved her life. Green listened without judgment, his hands never pausing in their skilled work. "Not the first time I've heard such a tale," he said when she had finished. "Seen too many women with the same haunted look in their eyes." He glanced up at Vivian with unexpected kindness. "And not the first time Fletcher here has stuck his neck out for someone in need, either. You know him well?" Vivian asked, curious about this aspect of Kieran's past. "Well enough," Green replied, applying a clean bandage to Kieran's now-stitched wound. "Served together briefly during the war. He was a scout for my regiment, best tracker I ever saw, saved a lot of lives, including mine." He straightened, wiping his hands on a cloth. "The man's got a talent for being exactly where he's needed when he's needed. Seems that talent hasn't faded." Kieran, drowsy from the laudanum Green had administered for pain, managed a weak smile. "Just happened to be in the right place at the right time, Doc. Or the wrong place at the wrong time, depending on how you look at it," Green retorted, though there was no heat in his words. "Your friend here needs rest, miss. What did you say your name was?" "Moore," Vivian replied, using the alias she had adopted. "Vivian Moore." Green nodded, though something in his expression suggested he wasn't fooled. "Well, Miss Moore, your protector here needs at least 2 days of complete rest. That infection was setting in deep, and he's lost more blood than he's letting on." "We can't stay that long," Kieran protested, struggling to sit up. "Thomas Mitchell isn't a man who gives up easily." "Neither is blood poisoning," Green countered firmly. "And that's what you'll be facing if you push yourself too hard. 2 days, Fletcher, doctor's orders." After Green had retired to the small room at the back of the cabin, leaving Vivian and Kieran the main room with its narrow cot and stone fireplace, Vivian found herself alone with Kieran for the first time since their flight from his burning cabin. In the soft glow of the single oil lamp, his features seemed both stronger and more vulnerable than before, the hard lines of his face softened by exhaustion, and something else, a tenderness that appeared whenever his eyes met hers. "You should get some sleep," Kieran said quietly, his voice rough with fatigue. "Take the cot, I'll be fine here by the fire." "Don't be ridiculous," Vivian replied, her tone brooking no argument. "You're injured and you need proper rest." "I've slept in far worse places than the floor beside a warm hearth." "Stubborn woman," Kieran murmured, but there was affection in his voice. After a moment he added more seriously, "Vivian, if Thomas tracks us here, then we'll face him together," she said firmly. "I'm not running anymore, Kieran, not without you." The weight of her words hung in the air between them, loaded with meanings neither was ready to voice aloud. Kieran reached out, his hand finding hers in the dim light. "Together, then," he agreed softly. As Vivian settled onto her makeshift bed of blankets near the fire, Kieran's steady breathing a comforting presence from the nearby cot. She felt a strange sense of peace, despite the dangers that still pursued them. Whatever came next, she would face it with this man beside her, this man who had shown her what it meant to be truly respected, truly valued. And perhaps, someday, truly loved. The next day passed in a blur of quiet activity. Vivian ventured into the small settlement to purchase supplies they would need for the journey ahead, while Green kept watch over Kieran, whose fever had broken during the night but who remained weaker than he wanted to admit. Prosperity was indeed a small town, with a single dusty street lined by a handful of businesses: a general store, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a blacksmith shop, and a few other modest establishments. The people were the usual frontier mix: grizzled miners, shopkeepers, a few women who might have been wives or might have worked at the saloon. It was hard to tell and impolite to ask. Vivian kept her head down, her hair tucked beneath a borrowed bonnet from Green's stores of items left behind by previous patients. She felt eyes following her as she moved through town. A new face was always a novelty in such isolated communities, but no one approached her directly. At the general store, she purchased flour, coffee, jerky, and other staples that would sustain them on the trail, along with bandages and medicines Green had recommended. The storekeeper, a thin man with spectacles and a perpetual frown, asked few questions beyond the casual inquiry about how long she planned to stay in Prosperity. "Just passing through," Vivian replied with a polite smile that revealed nothing. "My brother and I are heading to California. Family waiting for us there." The storekeeper nodded, apparently satisfied with this explanation. As he wrapped her purchases, however, he leaned across the counter and spoke in a lowered voice. "Word of advice, miss, if you're truly just passing through, might want to be on your way by tomorrow. Had some rough-looking fellas asking questions at the saloon last night, seemed mighty interested in newcomers to town." Vivian's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composure. "Thank you for the warning, sir. We do plan to leave soon." Hurrying back to Green's cabin, Vivian relayed the storekeeper's warning to Kieran and the doctor. Kieran immediately tried to rise, insisting they leave that very hour, but Green pushed him firmly back onto the cot. "You're in no condition to travel yet, Fletcher," the doctor said sternly. "Another day of rest, at least." "We may not have another day, Doc," Kieran argued, his face tense with worry. "If Mitchell's men are already in town asking questions, it won't take long for them to find us." Green considered this, his weathered face thoughtful. "I may have a solution," he said finally. "There's an old mine shaft about 3 miles up the canyon abandoned years ago when the silver ran out. It's hard to find if you don't know where to look, and it's got a back entrance that opens onto a trail leading west. You could shelter there tonight, be on your way at first light." It was a sensible plan, and by dusk, Green had helped them relocate to the abandoned mine. The entrance was indeed well hidden, concealed by a growth of scrub pine and boulders that had fallen from the cliff above. Inside, the main chamber was surprisingly spacious and dry, with timber supports that had stood the test of time. "Not exactly the Grand Hotel," Green remarked, as he helped Kieran settle onto a makeshift bed of blankets they had brought from the cabin, "but it'll keep you hidden until you're ready to move on." After ensuring they had everything they needed, food, water, extra ammunition for Kieran's rifle and pistol, Green prepared to leave. At the entrance, he paused, looking back at them with an expression that mingled concern and something like approval. "You know, Fletcher," he said, "in all the years I've known you, I've never seen you risk so much for anyone. Must be something special about this young lady." Before Kieran could respond, Green tipped his hat to Vivian with a knowing smile and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Alone once more, an awkward silence fell between them. Vivian busied herself arranging their supplies, acutely aware of Kieran's gaze following her movements. When she finally settled beside him, her back against the rough wall of the mine, he spoke quietly. "He's right, you know." Vivian looked up, meeting his eyes in the soft glow of the small lamp Green had left them. "About what? About you being special?" Kieran's voice was low, almost hesitant, so different from his usual confidence. I've spent years keeping to myself, avoiding entanglements, telling myself it was better that way, safer. Then you stumbled into my life and suddenly. He trailed off, searching for words. Suddenly what? Vivian asked, her heart beating faster. Suddenly solitude doesn't seem so appealing anymore. Kieran reached out, his fingers brushing a strand of hair from her face with exquisite gentleness. You've made me remember what it feels like to care about someone, Vivian. To want to protect them, not out of obligation or duty, but because the thought of anything happening to them is unbearable. Vivian's breath caught in her throat. Kieran, you don't have to say anything, he interrupted softly. I know your situation. You're still married in the eyes of the law, and I would never dishonor you by suggesting anything improper. But when we reach California, when you're truly free, he paused, his gray eyes searching hers. I'd like to court you properly if you'd allow it. Joy, unexpected and overwhelming, bloomed in Vivian's chest. I would like that very much, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Kieran's smile, rare and genuine, transformed his face. He took her hand in his, bringing it to his lips in a gesture that was both chivalrous and deeply intimate. Then we have something to look forward to, beyond just escape. That night, as they kept watch in turns at the mouth of the mine, Vivian felt a profound shift in her understanding of herself and her future. For years, her entire existence had been defined by fear of Thomas's temper, fear of saying or doing the wrong thing, fear of the pain that inevitably followed. But here, in this unlikely sanctuary with this unexpected man, she was beginning to remember who she had been before Thomas had broken her spirit, a woman with dreams, with courage, with the capacity for deep love. And though danger still lurked beyond their temporary refuge, for the first time, Vivian allowed herself to imagine a life beyond fear. A life where she might wake each morning beside a man who cherished rather than controlled her, who saw her strength rather than sought to diminish it. A life with Kieran Fletcher. Dawn broke clear and cold, sunlight filtering through the pine trees that concealed the mine entrance. Vivian, who had taken the last watch while Kieran slept, studied the valley below for any sign of Thomas or his men. The small town of Prosperity looked peaceful in the early light, smoke rising from chimneys as its residents began their day. Anything? Kieran asked quietly, coming to join her at the entrance. He moved stiffly but with more strength than the previous day, the rest and Green's medicine having done their work. Nothing unusual, Vivian replied, passing him the spyglass Green had lent them. But that doesn't mean they're not there. Kieran surveyed the town carefully before lowering the glass. We should move soon, follow the back trail Green mentioned. It'll take us west through the high country, rough going, but less chance of running into Mitchell and his men. They packed quickly and efficiently, leaving no trace of their presence in the mine. Leading their horses through the narrow back entrance, a tight squeeze that opened onto a steep, rocky path, they began their ascent into the mountains that would, they hoped, provide both barrier and pathway to freedom. The day passed in careful travel along game trails and forgotten prospectors' paths that only someone with Kieran's knowledge of the wilderness could follow. By mid-afternoon, they had climbed high enough to look back on Prosperity, now just a tiny cluster of buildings far below, nestled in its valley like toys in a child's playpen. We're making good time, Kieran observed, his voice stronger than it had been since his injury. Another day like this and we'll reach the western slope. From there, it's easier going toward California. Vivian nodded, trying to ignore the growing ache in her back from hours in the saddle. She was about to suggest they rest the horses when a glint of light from the valley below caught her attention. Kieran, she said urgently, pointing, look there on the eastern trail. Raising the spyglass, Kieran focused on the spot she indicated, his expression hardened. Riders, he confirmed grimly. 4 of them heading toward Prosperity, too far to make out faces, but it's them, Vivian said with certainty. Thomas wouldn't give up the hunt, especially not after being wounded. They're still hours behind us, Kieran said, lowering the glass. And unless they know about this trail, they'll waste time searching the town first. He glanced at Vivian, his expression softening slightly. We've got a good lead, Vivian. We can stay ahead of them. They pushed on through the afternoon and into the early evening, stopping only when the light began to fail and the trail became too treacherous to navigate safely. Making camp in a small, sheltered hollow surrounded by stunted pines, they kept their fire small and well hidden, conscious of the possibility that eyes might be scanning the mountainside from below. As they shared a simple meal of jerky and hardtack, Kieran winced visibly when he reached for his canteen, his hand going unconsciously to his wounded side. "Let me check your bandage," Vivian said, moving to kneel beside him. "You've been pushing yourself too hard today." "I'm fine," Kieran protested, but he didn't resist as she gently lifted his shirt to examine the wound. The stitches Green had placed were holding, and there was no sign of renewed infection, but the skin around them was red and tender. "You're not fine," Vivian countered, applying a fresh layer of the salve Green had provided. "But you will be if you don't tear these stitches open being stubborn." Kieran chuckled softly, the sound warming her more than the small fire. "Yes, madam," he said with exaggerated meekness. "Whatever you say, madam," Vivian couldn't help but smile as she finished tending to his wound. "That's right, and don't you forget it." Their eyes met over the fire, shared humor quickly giving way to something deeper, more intense. For a moment, Vivian thought Kieran might kiss her certainly. Everything in his expression suggested he wanted to. But instead, he reached out and squeezed her hand gently before pulling back, the honorable man winning out over desire. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "I'll take first watch." "Wake me in 4 hours," Vivian instructed, settling into her blankets. "And no heroics, you need rest too." As she drifted toward sleep, Vivian found herself thinking of the future that seemed to be taking shape before her. If they could stay ahead of Thomas, if they could reach California safely. Perhaps they could build something together, she and this quiet, remarkable man. A home. A life. A love untainted by fear and control. It was a beautiful dream, one that sustained her even as she slipped into slumber beneath the vast Wyoming sky, the dream shattered with the crack of a rifle shot. Vivian jerked awake, momentarily disoriented in the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting just enough light for her to see Kieran crouched at the edge of their small camp, rifle aimed into the surrounding blackness. "What is it?" she whispered, reaching for her pistol. "Someone's out there," Kieran replied tersely. "That shot came from down the slope, could have been a hunter, but I'm not taking chances. We need to move." They packed hastily, not bothering with the fire. It was nearly out anyway and would soon be cold ash. Leading the horses rather than riding to minimize noise, they continued up the trail in darkness, guided only by starlight and Kieran's unerring sense of direction. After about an hour of tense, silent travel, they paused in a small clearing to rest the horses and take stock of their situation. "Do you think it's Thomas?" Vivian asked, her voice barely audible above the soft rustle of pine needles in the night breeze. "Can't be sure," Kieran admitted, scanning the darkness behind them, "but I don't believe in coincidences." If Mitchell reached prosperity by nightfall, Green might have tried to mislead him, but he shook his head grimly. "Thomas doesn't strike me as a man who's easily fooled." "No," Vivian agreed softly, "he's not." They continued their journey as soon as the horses were rested, pushing through the night despite the risks of traveling unfamiliar mountain trails in darkness. By dawn, they had reached the highest point of their route, a windswept pass between two towering peaks. As the sun rose, painting the surrounding mountains in shades of gold and rose, Kieran finally called a halt. Both they and their horses were exhausted, and the relative safety of their position with clear views in all directions made it a reasonable place to rest briefly. "No sign of pursuit," Kieran observed, sweeping the lower slopes with the spyglass. "If they are following, they're keeping well hidden. Or they've taken another route," Vivian suggested, the thought sending a chill through her despite the warming day. Kieran nodded grimly. "It's possible. These mountains are full of old trails and passes, if Mitchell knows the area or has found someone who does." He left the implication hanging. They allowed themselves only an hour's rest before continuing westward. now descending toward the gentler slopes that would eventually lead to the great valleys of California. The terrain grew less rugged as they traveled, pine forests giving way to more open country dotted with aspen groves and flowered meadows. By late afternoon, they had reached a broad, grassy valley through which a clear stream meandered. It was idyllic, the kind of place where, under different circumstances, they might have lingered to enjoy the beauty of the wilderness. Instead, they pushed on, following the stream toward a distant line of trees that marked its course through the valley. They were halfway across the open meadow when Vivian heard the distant but unmistakable sound of horses approaching at speed. "Kieran," she called urgently, pointing back toward the eastern end of the valley. 4 riders had emerged from the tree line, moving fast in their direction. Even at this distance, Vivian recognized the broad-shouldered figure leading the group, Thomas, relentless in his pursuit. "Ride," Kieran shouted, urging his horse into a gallop. "For the trees." They raced across the remaining expanse of meadow, the thunder of hooves behind them growing steadily louder. Vivian's heart pounded in her chest as she bent low over her horse's neck, urging the animal to greater speed. Kieran rode beside her, his face set in grim determination, occasionally glancing back to gauge the distance between them and their pursuers. They reached the tree line with their lead narrowing but still intact, plunging into the relative safety of the forest. Here, the advantage shifted slightly in their favor. Kieran's knowledge of woodcraft allowed him to choose paths that were less obvious, to double back and cross the stream multiple times, confusing their trail. But Thomas and his men were not easily shaken. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the trees, Vivian and Kieran found themselves forced into increasingly desperate measures to maintain their lead. "There's a canyon ahead," Kieran said as they paused briefly to water their exhausted horses. "Narrow entrance widens inside. If we can get through and find a defensible position, we might be able to hold them off." Vivian nodded, too breathless from their flight to speak. She trusted Kieran's judgment, implicitly trusted him with her life, as she had from the moment he had intervened beside that creek, what seemed like a lifetime ago. The canyon entrance was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for a horse and rider to pass through single file. Inside, the space opened considerably, with high stone walls rising on either side and the stream they had been following cascading down in a small waterfall at the far end. It was a natural fortress with the right positioning. They could indeed defend against multiple attackers. But as they entered the canyon, Kieran suddenly reined in sharply, causing Vivian's horse to nearly collide with his. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed by the tension in his posture. "Listen," Kieran replied, his voice low with concern. In the gathering dusk, the canyon was eerily silent. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the undergrowth. It was the silence of a place where something or someone had recently disturbed the natural order. "It's a trap," Kieran said with sudden certainty. "Mitchell somehow got ahead of us, probably sent men around while he kept us running." He turned his horse, urgency in every line of his body. "We need to get out now," but it was too late. As they approached the narrow entrance through which they had just passed, 2 figures emerged from the shadows, rifles leveled at them. One was Clyde Wilson, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. The other was a stranger, one of the men who had been riding with Thomas. "That's far enough, Fletcher," Clyde called, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "Thomas wants a word with his wayward wife." As if summoned by his name, Thomas Mitchell appeared at the entrance to the canyon, his massive frame silhouetted against the fading light. He dismounted slowly, deliberately, like a man who knew he had all the time in the world. "Vivian," he said, his voice deceptively soft as he stepped into the canyon. "You've led me on quite a chase, my dear, but it ends now." His cold gaze shifted to Kieran. "As for you, Fletcher, I'm going to enjoy watching you die, slowly." Vivian felt a cold knot of terror form in her stomach, but alongside it was something else, a burning rage that had been building for 7 years, a determination not to be controlled, not to be victimized ever again. "No, Thomas," she said, her voice steady despite her fear. "It's over." I'm not going back with you, Thomas laughed, the sound echoing harshly in the enclosed space. You don't have a choice, wife. You belong to me by law and by God's will. No woman belongs to any man, Kieran said, his hand hovering near his holstered pistol, and Vivian's made her choice. It's not you, Thomas's face darkened with rage. You think you can steal another man's wife and live to tell about it, Fletcher. You're even more of a fool than I thought, he gestured to his men. Clyde, Jimmy, get the woman. I'll deal with this thieving bastard myself. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of moments that forever alter the course of lives. As Clyde and the man called Jimmy advanced, Kieran drew his pistol with lightning speed, firing once, twice. Jimmy fell with a cry, clutching his leg. Clyde managed to get off a shot that went wide before diving behind a boulder. Thomas, faster than his bulk suggested, drew his own weapon and fired at Kieran. The bullet struck him in the shoulder, spinning him halfway around but not unhorsing him. Vivian screamed, drawing her pistol and firing at Thomas, her shot grazing his arm. You little bitch, Thomas snarled, turning his gun toward her. I'll teach you. To the deafening crack of Kieran's rifle cut him off. Despite his wounded shoulder, Kieran had managed to level his weapon and fire with deadly accuracy. Thomas staggered, a look of profound surprise crossing his face as he looked down at the spreading crimson stain on his chest. You won't touch her again, Kieran said, his voice cold and certain. Not ever. Thomas Mitchell fell to his knees, then toppled forward onto the canyon floor, his blood staining the earth dark in the fading light. For a moment, silence reigned in the canyon. Then Clyde Wilson's voice called from behind his cover, tinged with fear rather than bravado now. Fletcher. We're done here. Mitchell's dead and Jimmy's in no shape to fight. Let us go and you'll never see us again. Kieran, pale from his own wound but still upright in his saddle, considered the offer. Throw out your weapons first, he called back. Then take Jimmy and go. If I ever see either of you again, I won't be as merciful. Moments later, Clyde emerged from behind the boulder, hands raised, his rifle and pistol tossed aside. With Kieran's rifle trained on him, he helped the wounded Jimmy onto a horse, then mounted his own. This isn't over, Clyde muttered as he passed Vivian, his eyes full of impotent hate. You killed a man today. No, Vivian replied steadily. Kieran killed a man who was about to murder me. There's a difference one the law will recognize should you be foolish enough to push the matter. Without another word, Clyde and Jimmy rode out of the canyon, leaving behind the body of Thomas Mitchell and the echoing silence of finality. As soon as they were gone, Vivian rushed to Kieran's side. He had slumped forward in his saddle, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. Kieran, she cried, helping him dismount. How bad is it? Been worse, he managed through gritted teeth, though the pallor of his face belied his words. Need to, bind it, stop the bleeding. Working quickly, Vivian tore strips from her petticoat, creating a pressure bandage for Kieran's wound. The bullet had passed through his shoulder, a clean shot, thankfully, with no need to dig for the lead. Still, the blood loss was significant, and night was falling rapidly. We need shelter, Vivian said, looking around the canyon. Somewhere to rest and tend to your wound properly. Far end, Kieran directed weakly. Cave behind the waterfall, used it once, hunting trip. Supporting much of his weight, Vivian helped Kieran to the rear of the canyon, where, as he had said, a small cave opened behind the cascading water. It was dry inside, and the sound of the waterfall would mask any noise. They might make a perfect hiding place, should Clyde Wilson decide to return with reinforcements. Using the meager supplies they had left, Vivian built a small fire near the mouth of the cave, its light partially concealed by the falling water. By its flickering glow, she cleaned and dressed Kieran's wound as best she could, her heart aching at each wince and suppressed groan of pain from the man who had risked everything to protect her. He's dead, Kieran said softly as she finished binding his shoulder. Thomas is really dead. Yes, Vivian replied, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. He can't hurt me anymore, can't hurt anyone, are you? All right, Kieran asked, his gray eyes searching her face in the firelight. Vivian considered the question carefully. She had just witnessed the violent death of her husband, a man she had once, in the naive optimism of youth, believed she loved. She should feel something. Grief, perhaps, regret, horror at the bloodshed. Instead, all she felt was a profound sense of liberation, as if chains that had bound her for 7 years had suddenly fallen away. It was not joy. She was not so callous as to rejoice in any man's death, even one as cruel as Thomas. But it was relief, pure and overwhelming. "I'm free," she said finally, meeting Kieran's gaze directly. "For the first time in 7 years, I'm truly free." Kieran nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. "Yes," he agreed softly, "free to choose your own path now, free to—" He hesitated, wincing as he shifted position. "Free to go wherever you want, be whoever you want to be." Vivian moved closer, taking his uninjured hand in hers. "I already know where I want to go," she said quietly, "who I want to be with." In the intimate space of the cave, with only the fire and the muffled sound of the waterfall as witnesses, Vivian leaned forward and pressed her lips gently to Kieran's. It was a brief kiss, chaste but filled with promise and a depth of feeling that needed no words to express. When she pulled back, Kieran's expression was one of wonder and tender joy. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "After everything you've been through, I would understand if I'm certain," Vivian interrupted, her hand coming up to cup his cheek. "More certain than I've been of anything in a very long time. I want a life with you, Kieran Fletcher, if you'll have me." Kieran's smile, slow and achingly sweet, was all the answer she needed. "There's nothing in this world I want more," he said softly. That night, as Kieran slept fitfully beside the small fire, his body fighting to heal from yet another wound sustained in her defense, Vivian kept watch at the cave entrance. Beyond the silver curtain of falling water, she could see stars appearing in the night sky, brilliant and uncountable in the clear mountain air. Thomas was dead. The man who had terrorized her, controlled her, nearly broken her, was gone from this world. Tomorrow they would bury him not out of respect, but to ensure that chapter of her life was truly, finally closed. Then they would continue their journey west toward California, toward a future they would build together. Vivian Mitchell, no, Vivian Moore now, she decided, reclaiming her mother's maiden name as her own, looked up at the vast, star-filled sky and felt something she had almost forgotten. Hope. Pure, unbounded hope for the days to come. 3 months later, the small town of Pine Ridge, California, celebrated the marriage of Kieran Fletcher to Vivian Moore in a simple ceremony held in the town's newly built church. The bride wore a dress of pale blue, the groom a clean suit that couldn't quite disguise his frontier bearing. They spoke their vows with steady voices and eyes that never left each other's faces, witnessed by the handful of friends they had made in their short time in the growing community. Their journey from Wyoming had been long but uneventful after the dramatic confrontation in the canyon. They had traveled slowly, allowing Kieran's wounds to heal properly, taking time to enjoy the freedom and growing bond between them. By the time they reached California, Vivian's status as a widow was established, and accepted without question the details of Thomas's death simplified to an unfortunate encounter with bandits in the wilderness. Pine Ridge, a small but thriving logging town nestled in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, had welcomed them without reservation. Kieran's skills as a hunter and tracker quickly earned him respect and steady work as a guide for the logging companies. Vivian, fulfilling the dream she had abandoned in her youth, secured a position as teacher in the town's one-room schoolhouse. They purchased a small cabin on the edge of town, with a view of the mountains and enough land for a garden and a few animals. It was modest but well built, and Kieran worked tirelessly to improve it, adding a second room, a proper stone chimney, a covered porch where they could sit in the evenings and watch the sun set behind the distant peaks. On this particular evening, a year to the day after their wedding, they sat together on that porch, Vivian's head resting on Kieran's shoulder as they watched the last light fade from the sky. His arm was around her waist, his hand resting protectively, lovingly, over the gentle swell of her abdomen where their child due in just 4 months grew stronger each day. Happy, Kieran asked softly, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Vivian looked up at him, at this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved, and smiled. Completely, she replied. Are you? Kieran's answer was to draw her closer, his free hand coming up to gently tilt her face toward his. More than I ever thought possible, he said before lowering his lips to hers. As stars began to appear overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting, their flight across the wilderness. Their first tentative acknowledgement of feelings that had grown into the deepest love, either had known Vivian and Kieran Fletcher held each other close, grateful for the second chances life had granted them, and for the future they would share, free from fear, rich in love, in their home beneath the California sky.